So, hello, Natalee Caple. Thanks so much for talking to me. I want to talk to you about titles and writing titles
Okay.
because I get a lot of questions about writing titles. What are some ways to do it? How do you tell what's a good title or a bad title, and so on and so forth? And I don't have, it's hard sometimes to talk about something really specific like that. The best thing I've actually seen, like in a writing textbook, is something Fred Stenson has a book called Thing Feigned or Imagined, and he talks really briefly about writing titles, and he more or less just says that the best title in his mind is something that has a different meaning after you've read the story. So like it means one thing, and then you read the story, then it means a different thing. And I think that's something. I mean, that makes sense, and we can talk about that a little later. But it's also at the same time like a very narrow response, but it's still the best response I've seen in these books. So I wanted to talk to somebody about really specifically about writing titles, and you popped into my head because one of my books, Clockfire, you were kind of instrumental in the title for that. I had this working title of clock hyphen fire because I just had this play with a clock and some fire. I had no idea for the book what I would do as a title, and so what I ended up doing was writing I don't know if you remember the details of this, but you were
I made a mistake writing a letter of reference for you, right? I made it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a mistake in the first place by writing a letter of reference for you. Within that letter.
Exactly. So within the letter, you basically had taken the hyphen out and combined Clockfire into one word.
Yeah.
And I had to scramble to rewrite all my application materials because you were kind of given this letter. In the course of doing that, I realized, Clockfire actually is a good title if I just were to take the hyphen out and combine it in one word like Natalee's done. So the kind of, technically you had made an error in writing my title, but really what you had done was fix my title.
I misread it because I thought that was the title. And I think that's my best title.
It's an excellent title, really, and it not only did I use it as the book title, like your kind of version of it, but I also kind of started calling the plays Clockfires. Because they were kind of these impossible plays. They weren't really poems, they weren't really plays. So I just started calling them Clockfires, and I decided it was a good name for even a kind of imaginary genre. So I really credit you with that, that title itself, and so you seem like a good person to talk to about titles. So I thought maybe that we just would kind of walk through your titles, and so if you don't mind. So here's Natalee's first book of short stories, The Heart Is Its Own Reason. And so I want to kind of ask a couple of things about this title. One is, it's a short story book, and so in the book you have a short story with that title.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, one, about your process, if you can remember writing this title, and two, why you chose the title of one of the stories as a book title, and why that story in particular. Sure.
That title is a riff off of Pascal's statement, "The heart has its own reasons, which reason knows nothing of," which has since been ruined by Woody Allen. But that particular story, I think, wasn't so important, except that it might have been a story where I kind of got my feet in terms of what I wanted to do with the project overall. And I started to write the short stories at that point towards the book. And the book was going to be a collection of short stories based on case studies taken from abnormal psychology, and kind of imagining these people and how people with things like Munchausen syndrome and, who would love them and what would constitute a bad day and that kind of thing. And so the title itself is a kind of overview of a kind of desired reception, a kind of openness that I desired for these characters.
Okay, so on one hand, you're kind of alluding to it taking off on this quote. On the other hand, it's sort of summarizing so it's also something the story is about. And then it's also, for you, it started summarizing the book concept, and you said it was kind of connected to when you started thinking of it as a book, or as a project, rather than these stories you were writing. So is that typical for you? Later on, you did this, another book of short stories, which I don't have because it's only in ebook form, but I mean, I have it, but I can't show it to you.
My parents.
Yes, how I came to haunt my parents, which is a really excellent title. I mean, it's probably my favorite of your titles, actually.
Yeah.
But was that a similar thing, or was that a different process for that short story book?
No, that was totally different. I just really liked that title the best of all the titles, right?
Sure.
And it was a more kind of playful title, I think, and the book itself explores a bunch of different genres of short stories, and so I wanted a title that would be kind of evocative, and people would not necessarily know what to expect. That's my only ghost story, how I came to haunt my parents. So, yeah.
So there you've got totally different concerns, but you're still taking a short story title and using it as a short story book title. Had you considered at any point for either of those books coming up with a different title that wasn't, like, not duplicating a short story title in that way, but having I guess you'd say, an original title, in the sense of, like, it doesn't come from a different story? Like, had you thought about that and discarded it, or?
Yes, but not as much with the books of short stories as with the novels. That happens much more often with the novels. I go through, like, probably a half a dozen to a dozen titles with novels. And usually I'll have a working title, which is just kind of to remind me of what it's supposed to be about. So that, so with The Plight of Happy People in an Ordinary World, that was never meant to be the title. Yeah.
First novel.
That was never going to be the title. It was just that it was this line that I would repeat to myself so that I could remember what the stupid thing was supposed to be about, right? And then I thought it would be called something like Nadia and Irma, or something that was more reminiscent of magic realism, because I was working with a lot of surrealist films at the time and things like that. But in the end, that line was the more memorable. And it's funny because I was also resisting the one-word titles at the time. Like when The Heart Is Its Own Reason came out, that was an Insomniac book. And I think there were, like, with poetry and fiction, Mike O'Connor from Insomniac had, I think, something like 6 or 8 books out that season, and all but mine were one-word titles. And the other authors joked that they all had to give up a word so that I could have my title. Right? And what ends up happening is that people have short forms for it as you're publishing it. But I don't know. In many ways, I've found that the title that's like a sentence is the one that people find more. They find it easier to remember in a way because it contains a kind of concept.
Sure. So, like with this book, so you're Plight of Happy People in an Ordinary World. So you're saying this was a working title that became the real title. That's right. So when did that happen? Like, what's the moment where you kind of decide the working title is the title? Does that make sense? When does it shift from being this tentative thing to this, I guess, a permanent thing?
Well, I sit down and brainstorm on titles. I look through for catchy lines, or I try and think about, like, just sort of write out different ideas that are central to the texts, right? So that I can imagine different ways that it can be called. And then when I do have a tagline like that helps me stay on target, I'll often ask the publisher, what do you think of this list of titles? And the publisher will have a sense of what they think is most marketable as well. And I don't know, I'm not terribly dear about the titles. Like, I don't think I would get too angry if the publisher said no. But, like, In Calamity's Wake, which is the most recent novel, that, of course, is a novel about a young woman who's searching for her adoptive mother, or her biological mother. She was adopted out, and she's searching for her biological mother, who was the infamous frontierswoman Calamity Jane. And so that word calamity is so unusual and so kind of intense and clanging that I certainly wanted that in. But for a while I thought, should it be Calamity's Wake? And then I thought, no, people will think it's too much like Finnegan's Wake. And then I thought, I think it was called...
It was just called Calamity at one point.
It was called Calamity at one point, and sometimes it had exclamation marks, and sometimes it didn't. And then while I was working on the book, my cousin was murdered, and so the title refers for me both to working on the book in the wake of that calamity and to all of the people who we encounter who've come in touch with Calamity Jane, and how this kind of like momentous figure swirling through history leaves a kind of wake of change, and how it's through her that Miette, her daughter, encounters all these other really interesting people who've been forgotten by history.
Sure. And that book, again, In Calamity's Wake.
Yeah.
I remember when you were writing this book,
Yeah.
because you and I were going back and forth about different things, and you let me see some early versions and stuff. And one thing that I remember you asked me at one point was like, "Do you have an idea for this title?" And I did not. Like you, I was like, it's got to have calamity in it, maybe just calamity. But then, and there is a niceness about calamity because it does have, of course, literally refers to her name or her adopted stage name. But it also has, of course, a secondary meaning of, a tremendous trauma or tragedy of, epic proportions. So I was like, I remember like thinking, it's not a bad title, but there did seem to be something about it that I don't know what it was. It didn't seem satisfactory somehow, and I know that you felt the same way, and I couldn't really come up with a better title. I wish I had, come up with this one because I like this title a lot. Like I think In Calamity's Wake really works. And you're right. There's something about the word "in," like Calamity doesn't quite do it, although it's not a bad title. In Calamity's Wake, as you say, it's not a bad title, but it does have these associations.
There's a sense of movement to In Calamity's Wake. You're in the wake. You're being moved along with this story, ideally, right? Or you're encountering people who are being moved along in the wake of something. That's almost preposterous. Like calamity is a funny word as well. It's a sort of like, it's you can imagine, cymbals crashing, right?
It's gonna, it is interesting the difference like that one word makes. So you're in it. So it's locating you as a reader. It's locating, I guess you'd say, the characters in a sense. They're all kind of in the wake of this figure somehow. It is interesting, like the difference it makes, and it doesn't have that connection to Joyce now that you might otherwise, like see as an illusion somehow.
And the frontier is a calamity as well, right? Mm-hmm. The sort of the settling of the West is a calamity. It's certainly a serious calamity for Indigenous people, and that comes up over and over again in the book. And the lives of the figures in the book are kind of perpetually in upheaval because they're trying to start a new world.
And so but what makes Calamity unsatisfactory as a working title? Like that's the thing I want to get at. Like, where is it in the working title? Like, because you have like in this case, you've got a working title, and it's unsatisfactory, and you move towards let's call it a real title.
Yeah.
In this case, you've got a working title, and then you decide it is satisfactory.
Yeah.
And so, like, what I want to get is like, what is the functional difference? Like, if you're a writer sitting there looking at your title, like, how do you make this decision? This title does work versus this title doesn't. Like, what are some techniques you could do, or some tricks, or like advice you might give to somebody who's again they've got maybe this working title and they don't really know whether it works, I guess you'd say.
Well, you ask a lot of people, and you try writing it out, and I sit down and sort of say, well, what are all the things that this title potentially signals? Like, as you say, Fred Stenson described a title as supposedly having some meaning. I think a title has to add something to the story to some degree, right? So that it gives you potentially a way of reading a story, but also it's a kind of beacon, right, for the person who might want to read this story. So the problem I have with one-word titles is that they're so often repeated, right?
Sure.
There's like however many versions of a book called Hunger. One of them is really good. And it's read by Newt Hampson, but there are lots of books called Hunger. And I think that the longer titles can contain ideas, and I like that because I tend to write towards ideas. So like I'll say, because you actually helped me title one book, which was the Semiconducting Dictionary, Our Strindberg, right? So I knew I wanted Strindberg.
I remember working on the book, but I don't remember.
No, well, because I didn't tell you. Right?
Oh, okay.
So we were having a conversation about titles, actually, and you said, sometimes I think that the title shouldn't have anything to do with the book.
Oh, yeah.
That if you find a title and you really like it, you should just put it on any book, right? And then let the readers work it out.
Sure.
Right? And I thought to myself, I'd had this title for a long time, the Semiconducting Dictionary. And I loved that title, but I didn't have a book for it. So I thought of a bunch of different books that I could write for this title. But I had a book, and it didn't have a title, right? And then that one had been like, it had been Imaginary Person, it had been Strindberg, sometimes with exclamation marks. It had been it had been Breaking the Eye, it had been all these different things. And then I thought, I love this title, the Semiconducting Dictionary. And I think that could refer to this book, because it could refer to pretty much any book, right? A book.
So, it's a nice metaphor for a book. It's here's all these words, yet there's some current passing through them.
Exactly.
And this thing that's pulling through them. And in this case, Strindberg, of course, is the thing you're pulling through.
Yes.
Your sort of imaginary biography, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, and the book becomes a kind of world of its own, right, with its own laws. And in this case, as you say, a kind of shared Strindberg, a kind of shared public figure is the kind of fluctuating current that moves through that book. So so that's how I came to that title. So in some ways, it's just like it's a personal negotiation. When it starts to mean something to you, right? And then it matters, right? Then then you can kind of see the book through it, and I think you need to be able to see the book through it. Like the problem is that there are so many titles that are just like two people's names or one person's name, and then you're like, well, I don't know, it was a woman's name. Maybe it was Veronica. Maybe it was Lolita. Maybe it was, right? And those are great books. But I think that later on it becomes harder to remember.
Sure. As like Calamity Jane wouldn't work, right?
Yeah.
For that kind of reason you were talking about.
Well, there are books called Calamity Jane that are nonfiction, right?
Well, that's the other issue. Because that's the kind of weird thing about a title, too. I mean, a title, especially a book title, it is in this kind of weird position where, one hand, you want to tell this artistically makes sense somehow. On the other hand, it's effectively a marketing concern. And that's why, of course, publishers, as you kind of alluded to before, like, publishers usually reserve, and this is something that students are often really surprised to learn, is that it's a standard clause in a publishing contract to give control of the title to the publisher. And that is usually, like, depending on the size of the publisher and so on, it's a marketing department decision, like what title this book has.
It is and it isn't. It would be pretty unusual for the publisher to actively fight.
True. But if we get down to the paper, I mean, they can, right? They can take the title away from you. Which is not standard.
I wanted to call it Rita Parsons, for example. Right?
Yeah, and it's, as you say, it doesn't normally occur. Like, I've never had an argument about a title with a publisher, for example. At best, the one sort of back and forth I had with the title was for the anthology I did recently. They wanted the words "an anthology" in the subtitle, which makes sense. I just never occurred to me. You should put "an anthology," but of course, how do you know it's an anthology? So that makes sense. But I mean, that's such a.
It has that feeling of like, am I supposed to put a book down in there too? Right?
They'll often put a novel on the cover or whatever stories.
No short stories.
Yeah, which again, sometimes an author cares about, sometimes an author doesn't care about it. But you are in this weird position of trying to write something that satisfies these multiple audiences, and it's also for, like, the title is for the person who read the book, and it's for the person who hasn't read the book. In a different sort of way. Like, the last chapter is not for the person who hasn't read the book. Like, it's a different type of writing in a sense. But let's just look at the Strindberg book for a second. So one of the things about the Semiconducting Dictionary is you've got the subtitle here, R. Strindberg, and you put the subtitle. So one is the subtitle, and two, it's in brackets.
Yeah.
So I want you to just talk a bit about, one, the experience, like putting a subtitle in there. Like, so you had this title, the Semiconducting Dictionary. You wanted it to refer to this book. Yeah. So one, why the subtitle, and two, why in brackets rather than the colon, the typical subtitle version?
Well, because it makes Strindberg the Semiconducting Dictionary by putting it in brackets, as opposed to creating it as one sentence or something like that. Sure. It has a kind of funny to the side effect, right? It's like, Strindberg. And the book itself has that kind of. You think you're talking about Strindberg, but maybe you're really talking about Natalee, right? Or, it's me as Strindberg. Yeah. But so there's that. I think that I also wanted it searchable, so that if somebody was looking up works on Strindberg, this would come up.
Sure.
So. Yeah,
I mean, that's another thing people don't think about, but these titles are the way people find the books, especially now that you're online, you're finding books, by searching, as you say. If you want a book on poems about Strindberg, if the book doesn't have poems, Strindberg, I mean, it's very hard to find that thing.
Well, the title is one of the most privileged places in the book, right? It's one of the few parts of the book that has a life of its own, that will be found and seen and known on its own. And there are lists of world's best titles, and people may never read the books, but they know these incredible titles, right? Yeah. And the title's job is to set a tone. It's to make the book appealing to the correct reader, so that making people, you're not missing the person that you want to find. And it's so hard to find readers. The title is, it's necessary that it be remembered, because unless you just think that they're going to click it every time, the first time they see it, right? But even then, you want it to be something that would make somebody curious to find out more about it. But the title is probably with the opening lines, one of the most important parts of kind of grabbing the reader. Yeah. In those initial phases, because what do you do? Even if you encounter the book just on a table, you see the cover. Well, the writer has very little control over the cover most of the time. You see the cover, you see the title, you open it, you read the first couple of lines, right?
And it's also part of the cover. Like, typically, like, I can pull up books that don't have the title on the cover, but I mean, normally it's part of the cover. So, as you say, I mean,
the cover off a book that doesn't have a title on the cover.
Sorry?
I'd like to see you pull off
Fiorentino's last book of short stories doesn't.
Okay.
And so I was talking to him about that at one point, and he had mentioned that it's on the spine.
Yeah.
His argument was, the cover, people never see the cover anymore unless they're online, and on the cover you just have like, nobody can pay to have your book out like this in the store anymore.
That's right.
So if it's on the spine, that's really what you see in the store. Online, you have the text beside it, so who cares if it's on the cover? So so he had an argument with the publisher and won the argument, so that's one I can think of, and I know I've seen others, but
it's unusual though.
It's unusual, and so in terms of, like, again, as you say, like, what do you like? Those are the two things that typically, whether they're consulting with you or not, the publishers reserve the rights of, is like the title and the cover.
Yeah.
Like I've been very lucky. I've always gotten what I wanted on the cover. Yeah. And I've been asked what I wanted, and I've always gotten the title that I wanted, which, as you say, it's more normal to have control of that. And you, of course, always have control, because you can always back out in a sense.
Yes.
But but in terms of the words you write that appear on the cover, I mean, those are the words. So it is interesting.
I've always had control in that I've had that kind of ability to say no right? And certainly most of the time we'll go through several covers before we find a cover that I'm okay with, because usually I have the battle of like, please no half-naked headless women. Anything else?
Sure.
And then I get a choice of like 3 different half-naked headless women. And I'm like, well, the blue one. That's not true. That only happened once. That happened with Mackerel Sky. But otherwise, my experience was fantastic with Mackerel Sky. But yeah, I think that that writers often think that they have complete control over every part of the book and its marketing, and you just don't. Like you have the ability to suggest and to bring things in, and that's about it, right?
Well, I like to tell people, like, you have different levels of control depending on how reasonable you are,
yes,
and how nice you are, and
well,
also
and
how good you are. Like, for example, picking a cover.
Yeah.
Like,
well, you brought them really striking images that were available.
Yeah, I was in every instance. I've been lucky, except for the anthology, which was a different process. But in every instance for my covers, either there was a, basic guy was asked, "What do you want to cover?" and I said this, and they said, "Great." I had a bit of back and forth with Politics of Knives with Alana, where she was kind of against the cover that I wanted, and I basically said, "Well, you're in charge." I wasn't going to push on it, but I said, this is the thing I want. This is why I want it. She was worried. The cover of the Politics of Knives has, just for people who haven't seen it, it's a bunch of butterflies being nailed to the wall. Yeah. Her objection was, it seems a little unsubtle. And my point was, well, it's absolutely unsubtle.
Yeah.
And so I just want it to be as unsubtle as possible. And so she came around to agreeing with me and deciding that she liked the cover better than the other options. But I mean, I wasn't pushing on it in a way. Yeah. I was just making my preferences clear. But it is a thing where you get more control the more you actually can do it, because a lot of authors have no idea.
Yeah, if you bring in a picture that is available that they can work with, and the other problem is that authors are not necessarily good designers, right? So I remember I brought in a series of photos that I loved this was for the Semiconducting Dictionary, but they were images of an artist's work, and they were these kind of pinhole cameras that were made out of books, and so the books themselves were carved. Well, the problem is that they were very text heavy, right? So it was going to be difficult as a design to use for design because it already had a lot of text on it. Sure. So it just wasn't, they were great images, but it wasn't a good idea for the book. And then they came in with something that there was a different cover that I didn't like, and I was like, well, why don't you just put like clouds on it and a mustache? And they did that. This is great. I like it. Yeah.
But again, in terms of the title, this is the thing you really have more control over. Right? Yeah. And so, getting back to Mackerel Sky, I have this version of it. I think there's another version.
There's my headless, half-naked woman.
Yes. So, but Mackerel Sky. So, let's get back to titles maybe for a second. So, how did you kind of get into that title? What was your process for coming up with it? Because it's a very different type of title. It's much more. I mean, it's a clear image. In a sense, it's much more imagistic, and it has less obvious connection to the content. It's not like Strindberg.
If I gave it a title like that, then I would have control over the cover image, because of course they would choose to put a Mackerel Sky on, right? Sure. Which happened in the States, but didn't really happen here. Mackerel Sky, well, is it's a kind of phenomenon where you see mackerel banding as those kind of like ribbed clouds, right? And when you see that, it means that there's convection in the upper atmosphere and that there's going to be some shift in the weather. Usually it means a storm of some kind. And so I thought, here's this story where a man is coming back into his daughter's life, the daughter that he's never met, and re-encountering this woman who seduced him when he was 17 and she was in her 20s. And it turns out they're all counterfeiters up in the Upper Laurentians, right? And so everybody's lives are about to change because of this person coming back. And he kind of gets right in the middle of the crime, and that becomes a problem. And so I wanted a title that was very visual, because the book is quite visual, very influenced by films from the French New Wave. So the book is very, very visual. I wanted something that you would read and say, I wonder what that is. And then if nothing else, even if you don't like the book, you probably looked up and found out, well, in reading the book, you'd find out what a macro sky is. And that's a useful piece of information. Right?
Sure. So maybe just kind of jump, like before we maybe talk more about that, like the other book you've got here is, of course, another poetry book, A More Tender Ocean. So again, it's a much more of a kind of imagistic or metaphorical, like clearly metaphorical title than maybe some of the others, other than Semiconducting Dictionary, which has a sort of disconnection. But I mean, it operates like a metaphor, basically.
Yeah.
So maybe, what was the process of this title? And
that title.
Again, now you're doing a poetry book, so this is your first poetry book, a different genre as well. Like, did that make a difference in terms of the type of title you wanted to pick?
Hold up the cover for a minute there.
This is
you see that image there?
Did you take this picture or something?
It's actually a photograph that by Michael Ondaatje of koi fish swimming in a pond, but what you can see is the reflection of all the trees. So it's as if they're swimming through the trees. And the book itself was part of, it was a kind of project that I had where I was experimenting with a surrealist technique that I had created, riffing off of other surrealist techniques, where I would take books that I wasn't very familiar with, and I would look at the page quickly, and then I would write the poem that I thought I saw there. And eventually I was working with like multiple poems at once, or poems that weren't in English, but surprised the poem that I saw was always in English, right? And then so that generated, I don't know, some 300 some odd poems. And they were automatic poems. Then that was kind of winnowed down to whatever 80 representative pages of pretty tender material, and all of which, in a way, is reflecting on the works of other writers. But reflecting on them with, I think, a great deal of tenderness. And so I think that the title is kind of, I was going through a phase where I was deeply in love with surrealist work, but not in love with the kind of insider-outsider politics of the surrealists themselves, and certainly of the poetry world. And so it was a kind of profession of, this is what I would prefer, right?
Sure. And so this is another book where you've actually got, like, again, one of the poems is called A More Tender Ocean. So,
but that was after.
That was after.
Yeah. So
that's what I was going to ask you. So you cheated and wrote this title later. Were you writing all the poem titles afterwards?
Evidence after the fact. What?
Were you writing all the poem titles after you drafted the poems, or was that part of the? Did it just depend on the poem itself? And when you're doing that surrealistic process, are you writing the titles at the same time?
No, I don't think I mean, I might have done that some of the time, but I don't think so, because I would be sitting there writing, because it was automatic writing. I would do, 10 or so poems, out of which maybe one I liked, or part of one I liked, or something like that. Sure. So the titles were really very much applied later. Sometimes they were there just to remind me of which book it was that I was reading, so that I can sort of say, okay, well, this was a reflection on Paz doing this, right? Or this was a reflection on this other thing. But then that became, like, when I lined up all the poems, that became annoying. Like, when you're looking at a book, you don't really want to see these kind of, this obvious code that is not for you, right?
Sure.
So
So, when you were coming up with that title, then was
yeah,
it a serialistic technique to get the title, or are you just sitting there, generating a title in the sort of normal way?
in a much more normal way. It was like, what is my issue with this thing that I love? I love surrealism. What is my issue with it? My issue with it, I think, was that um, that
It wasn't a tender enough ocean.
wasn't a tender enough ocean. Yeah, it was a little dehumanizing for its own participants at different points in time. So, for example, I'm particularly fond of Anthony Artaud, and I find it, heinous that he could be thrown out of surrealism, or this sort of like this necessity to join the Communist Party or something like that. These things that seem to me to be unnecessarily demanding
Sure.
when there was supposed to be some sort of community being built.
Yeah, and is explicitly opposed to surrealist ideas.
Yes, yeah.
By which civilization and society is this imposition. I mean, they're very like, well. Anyway, coming back to titles for a second. So, is there one of these techniques that you find like you've gone through like a bunch of different types of books. You've got a lot of different types of titles. You've got different ways of generating the titles. Um, what do you think is specific? Like, what is it in a book that you will? Is there a thing that you'll find yourself seizing on when it comes time to really settle on a title? Does it just depend, or is there some thing that, like, how do you know when you've got something? It's a kind of a vague question, but I guess the question I have is sort of again here's a book with like 80 or so possible titles.
Yeah, sure.
You could seize on any one of them, or you could just not have any of them as a title.
For me, the title has to be something. When I can see the whole book through it, then I know that that's a good title. When the title itself becomes a way for me to explain the book, then that's a title that works. It has to be a kind of articulation of something that I got out of producing the book at that point in time, some kind of purpose that I had.
So is it always after the fact for you? Like, is there ever a point, maybe for a book or even a story or something, where you really had a title and you didn't have anything for it?
Yeah.
So that kind of is the case of Semiconducting Dictionary. But, when you kind of started attaching it to this, it's not like you were using it as a working title and then you devised a book for it. Like, have you ever worked that reverse direction, where you really have a title but nothing else? You're just
I have a short story called The Proud Selenographer, where I just had this title and I had to figure out some characters that might come out of that title. And I had another, let's see. Oh, The Trouble with Killing Someone You Know was another, right?
It's one of my favorite titles in that whole book. So that was something you had, that title, and you were...
Yeah, I had this title, like The Trouble with Killing Someone You Know. And I'm sure, like, that was some kind of line that came up in a silly conversation with somebody. And then I thought, well, what kind of characters would work for this, right? And so it becomes a story about trying to kill somebody, but, not being a killer. And so, like, messing it up over and over again and having to go back in and try again a different way. So,
sure. That's a really great story. But that title, it just has a certain, I don't know, it just grabs you. And I think
it has a good rhythm.
It's similar to how I came to Haunt My Parents in a sense. Like, it's almost explanatory. But of course, the story itself is not.
Yeah.
But it's almost like the kind of like a magazine article title. There's this nice clash between, in those cases, like this nice clash between the stories and the titles. So when is that clash something you think is useful or interesting? Does that, when you have maybe some disconnect?
It seems like when it starts to feel like a conversation between that the reader has jumped in the middle of, right? And so now they want to know what the whole context is. Because The Trouble with Killing Someone You Know is, it's almost like a starting point for a conversation.
Sure. And it almost seems funny, but the story is not. I mean, it has certain moments of humor.
Yeah.
I guess you'd say, like kind of a black humor. But I mean, it is interesting how, on one hand, it is the opposite of what you were talking about before, where the tone is off, like it's off tone, but it still really works. Where else maybe would you direct somebody to look or like to do if they were really having a hard time with a title? So they've got an existing work. Let's just say a couple of different scenarios. So you say you've got an existing work.
You look for things like best lines, key images. Are there like, what were you reading or thinking about or watching while you were working on it? If it's a historical thing, sometimes it's, they're great nicknames. Like I'm working on a pirate book right now, and at the moment the working title is Back from the Dead Red and the Jaguar Child, right? And that's because there are two really fabulous nicknames that can potentially be used there.
That's also
you look
title,
at... Sorry, go ahead.
That's also a title where you've got this action genre, like this kind of action-adventure genre that had certain types of titles. So it kind of is a title that is like, it fits the genre, I guess you'd say. Like, to what degree do you feel like that's...
It has a speed to it, too. You want the title to have a similar kind of tone and speed to the text, right? So Back from the Dead Red and the Jaguar Child is a kind of a speedy title where you can imagine the kind of like sword fights and such that might be happening. It also has a kind of contemporary feel, kind of like contemporary North American fiction feel. And it's a title that provokes questions, like who are these two figures? So I think that a title that provokes questions is always good. And with the politics of knives, exactly, right? You're like, well, what are the politics of knives, right? Do they have politics?
Like I often will just come up with a good phrase or word or something, and I'll just try to think through, well, what could that be a title for? And I'll generate ideas that way, which I've heard some people do and other people don't. But I've always found that to be like a useful process. You get some sort of phrase you like, and you just kind of keep thinking through, well, what would it mean? Or what does politics of knives mean? I mean, I just started thinking, well, you've got assassination as an obvious sort of metaphor in there. I started thinking about censorship, the kind of cutting of things. I mean, eventually I get this text where you've got, all these words are blacked out. Like for me, it's a very analytical process, but I know for a lot of people, it's not about that at all. It's more about, trying to hit a tone or have an image that has some sort of broader resonance. Like Mackerel Scott's a nice example there. You've got this really, nice core image that really connects to things and starts to summarize in some ways what's going on in that book. But at the same time, it doesn't have a literalness to it, even though it's kind of operating.
It has a literal meaning. There is such a thing as a mackerel sky. It doesn't have a literal meaning in relationship to the to the text. Yeah,
like as you say, there actually is. That's a phrase from somewhere that you're kind of utilizing in a particular way. Were you worried at any point like that about it being a phrase from somewhere? Does that make sense?
No, I like that.
Yeah. As opposed to a semi-conducting dictionary. Like, where did you get that title then? You're saying you kind of had that title basically before you attached to the book, but where did the title itself come from? Do you remember?
It's a title. The title refers to kind of
like when you had that phrase. Do you remember like getting that phrase?
Yeah, it was me talking about what I thought a book should be, what a book should do, right? A book should be a kind of world into itself that explains itself, and that is kind of self-powered, but that changes depending on the person interacting with it. And so I try to subvert my authority in different ways as a writer, so that the reader has a lot of room to read themselves into the books.
That's a nice summary of what a title should be, really, as well. I could see a title as a semi-conducting dictionary in that same sense. It's interesting. I just want to ask you a couple questions before I let you go about this new book title that you've come up. So you're writing a book you're calling "Back from the Dead: Red and the Jaguar Child." So that's your title. Now, at what point, what would have to happen for you to abandon that title? Like, I like that title a lot, but I mean, what would have to happen for you to decide it's not a good title?
Well, I mean, a whole bunch of different things can happen in the process of writing the book. You can discover that that you don't like the reference to Jaguar children, which is it's a nasty way that in the 16th century people were superstitious and felt that children with Down syndrome were Jaguar children. That you may find that I may find that I don't feel that can be redeemed after all. My publisher may say, no, that's not good enough. Somebody else might come out with a book called Back from the Dead: Red and the, Porta Potty, right? Or something like that. It's one of those things that you think is so impossible, but it wasn't long ago that somebody in the States came out with a novel, and it was called By Grand Central Station, I Sat Down and Cried.
Yeah.
And I'm like, ridiculous. How can you not know that By Grand Central Station, I Sat Down and Wept is a famous Canadian book, right? So
one hopes they didn't know because it's a terrible title. Like, that's the thing, is Wept and is great, Cried is terrible.
Yeah.
And it's hard to kind of explain that sometimes, like, to somebody, but it's true.
Yeah.
Like, it destroys the title to use Cried rather than Wept. And it's just,
it's also just too close, right?
Well, it seems like either they know of the smart book, but they don't know the biblical reference.
Yeah.
Or they have somehow screwed up the biblical reference, but don't know the smart book, or there's some other just randomness that caught in their brain and they unconsciously pulled it up without knowing what it was. Yeah, but there's just so many things that can go wrong. Like, one word can throw it off, or one word can save it, like in Calamity's Wake, right?
Yeah.
It was interesting. So, yeah, I'm very curious to see, like, whether you keep that title. I mean, it's such a great sounding title, but as you say, like, there's so many. You're still writing the book, so it's hard to say. I mean, I had the reverse thing, right, with Clockfire. I thought it was a terrible title. It's garbage. Then if you just take the hyphen out and put it as one word, it's perfect. Whereas
genius.
With Ex Machina, I really loved that title. I was into it, and all these justifications and why I liked it. I still like it, but it has caused me some problems that there's a comic book series called Ex Machina.
Oh yeah,
And I've seen a lot of instances where that's been an issue, and I've gotten. I get it with my name, even, like Jonathan Ball.
Yeah.
There's a famous John Ball who wrote In the Heat of the Night, and so never mind like people, Jonathan Ball publishers in Zaire or something.
Yeah.
I get their mail half the time. Like, I'm not going to change my name for that reason, but it is one reason why.
Well,
I
Emily
use
Schultz
Jonathan
had that.
rather than John.
Emily Schultz had that happen quite famously recently with the Stephen King book coming out,
Yeah.
Joyland. Right, and her book Joyland was out several years ago. So what you've got to do is cash the checks.
Yeah. So I haven't had any problems where I've got too many checks coming in, but I'm really hoping, like, maybe Ex Machina, that'll happen. Like, that'll become a movie or something, and people start buying my book.
Maybe what you need to start doing is deliberately choosing the same title as this John Ball.
I used to joke all the time. My joke always with Coach House is, I've done 2 books with them, and both times, I'm sure they either didn't notice it or got sick of it. But both times, when they kind of were showing me the proof of the cover and saying, is there anything else we should do? Does this look good? My comment in both instances was, I think you should change the name to Stephen King. Maybe put a V in there, just in case if there's a legal issue.
Yeah.
That probably would help.
Yeah, well, just put like Stephen King and then put Jonathan Ball in
Stephen King writing as Jonathan Ball. Something like that. By the time they sue me, I'll have made enough money.
Yeah, I'm not even sure that he would. He might find it very entertaining.
You never know. Well, thanks very much, Natalee, for this. And again, it's one of the things that people ask me constantly is, like, how do you come up with titles? And in some way, there's not a good answer because it's so specific to the thing that they're doing. But I think it does help to kind of like walk through the process and to see the different options and they'll see like the real world sort of scenarios of why you would do this or why you would do that. And just to note that things can shift and change because sometimes I feel with writing, a lot of times people fix it in their mind. And you sometimes have to do tricks to get yourself out of feeling married to the thing that you've done. And sometimes just switching the title can do that. Other times there's extreme sort of cases. Like I sometimes when I edit, I'll print things off and retype them. Just so I don't feel bound to the text that's on the screen. Other people don't have that problem maybe, but I feel like there's certain things you can do to kind of make the thing seem like it's more in progress or more done, depending on what you need. And the title certainly really plays into that. Because it is a weight. When you've got a title, I don't know how you feel about it, but like anytime I've ever hit on a title that I thought was really great, it's like a glorious moment. It's like one of the few, really, exciting moments in, what is otherwise usually a slog for me.
Yeah. Well, I had my moment when I wrote How I Came to Haunt My Parents. I knew that my parents would read that book. And it was funny because for some reason, they were Googling, my mother was Googling herself online, and the title came up, and I hadn't talked about it yet. And they were like, oh my gosh, what is this?
That's great. Well, thanks very much. I'll let you go with that. I really appreciate it. Natalee Caple, I wish there was a bunch of people here who could clap for you. But so I'll just give you a clap there.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye.